Damien's point of view.
I leaned back in the cold stone chair of the tower, letting the silence settle around me. The air was thick with the scent of iron. Blood. Lord Seth stood a few feet away, watching me closely, his sharp gaze never wavering. His presence, as always, was unsettling. He had been the one I left in charge, the one who maintained order in my absence. Yet now, he stood there, arms crossed, questions heavy in the air. "What is going on, Draven?" Seth's voice broke through the quiet, laced with suspicion. His eyes narrowed as he studied me, then flicked to the wooden bowl of blood I held in my hands. "Who's that girl you brought here? I smelled your venom in her. Who is she?" I didn't answer right away, staring down into the bowl of blood. The liquid was dark, rich, and inviting. With a swift movement, I brought the bowl to my lips and drank deeply, the blood sliding down my throat in a satisfying, warm rush. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, savoring the way it still fueled the fire in my veins. "She's nothing," I said, my voice flat, trying to sound indifferent. "Just someone I know." Seth's expression didn't change, but I could feel his doubt radiating off him. He wasn't convinced. "What do you mean she's nothing?" he pressed, his tone sharp, cutting through my weak attempt at deflection. "You can't fool me, Draven. I know you. You're not the type to bring any woman into any of your territories, especially not a human. She's the first woman I've seen with you since your wife's death. That only means one thing. She's someone." I growled, my patience wearing thin. "That's enough, Seth," I barked, slamming the bowl down on the table beside me. "I told you. She's nothing." Seth didn't flinch, though I could see a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He knew me well enough to tread carefully, but even my bark couldn't silence his instincts. He recovered quickly, straightening as he met my gaze again. "What you just did says otherwise. But I'll let it go," he said, though his voice remained steady and unyielding. "Just know her presence is known by everyone here. They won't touch her, not with every trace of you on her, but she's still in danger. You need to get her out of here." I stood and placed a hand on his shoulder, tapping it firmly. "Don't worry. I brought her here for a reason, and I'll take her back when it's time." Seth eyed me for a moment longer, before giving a small, reluctant nod. I stepped away from him, making my way toward the stone staircase that led to the top of the tower. The evening wind hit me the moment I reached the top of the tower, the sky bathed in the deep hues of twilight. I climbed higher, reaching the cliff at the edge of the mountain. I stood there, breathing in the crisp evening air, trying to calm the hunger still gnawing at me. Keilah's blood had stirred something within me, something primal, something dangerous. I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes as a familiar hunger simmered in my veins. It gnawed at me relentlessly, a constant reminder of what I had almost done. The memory of her nearly lifeless form haunted me, but that wasn't all. Her blood had awakened something deeper and darker within me, a primal urge I couldn't ignore. I could still taste its warmth on my lips, an electric pulse thrumming through my body. I exhaled sharply, desperate to clear my mind and push the darkness back into the shadows. The wind howled through the mountains, and as much as I tried to push the hunger away, I couldn't. It was as though her scent had burrowed itself deep into my senses, a constant, intoxicating presence. Even from this distance, I could smell her. It was maddening. Her blood called to me, a siren song that whispered promises of power, of satisfaction, of danger. I clenched my jaw, trying to shut it out, trying to keep myself grounded. But her scent, her voice, they echoed in my mind. It was too strong. The primal part of me, the part I thought I could control, roared back to life. My fangs lengthened, and I could feel the hunger clawing its way to the surface. It made me want to sink my teeth into her skin, to taste the warm, electric blood flowing through her veins again. My chest rose and fell rapidly. I couldn't contain it much longer. Damn it. I spun around suddenly, my entire body tensing as I sensed something. Her fear. The scent of it was sharp, cutting through everything else. Without a moment's hesitation, I vanished, my body becoming nothing more than a blur in the wind as I swished through the air and across the cliffside, guided by the pull of her presence, just in time to see her standing there, wide-eyed, cornered by 3 vampires. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and I could see the terror reflected in her eyes as she darted glances between the vampires and the steep drop of the cliff. In a heartbeat, I swept her up from the cliff's edge and glided a few feet away, setting her down gently on solid ground, away from danger. The vampires lowered their heads quickly before one of them started. "We weren't trying to hurt her, King Draven," he said quickly, his voice shaky. "She was too close to the edge. We were only trying to help her from falling over." I narrowed my eyes at him, my muscles tense, but then gave a curt nod, dismissing them with a wave of my hand. "Leave." I turned to Keilah. She was still shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts, her eyes wide and accusing, locked onto mine. Her fear had faded, replaced by something else, anger. "Where the fuck did you bring me?" she demanded, her voice trembling, but laced with fury. "Where in the heavens am I?" I could see the confusion written all over her face. "I had to bring you somewhere safe," I said, my voice low, but the explanation felt weak even to my own ears. Keilah shook her head, taking a step back from me. "Safe? You call this safe?" She gestured to the cliff, her voice rising. "I don't even know what this place is, and now you've got vampires stalking me." I sighed, running a hand through my hair, knowing that there was no easy answer to give her. "This place, it's where I go when I need to control myself. It's the only place where I can protect you." She cut me off with a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Protect me? From what, Damien? From you?" Her words hit harder than I expected, and for a brief moment, I couldn't respond. The truth was, she wasn't wrong. Her eyes darted wildly, scanning the horizon, then snapping back to me, her brow furrowed in disbelief. She lifted her trembling hand, pointing off into the distance. "Look," she said, her voice strained. "This is the middle of nowhere. I don't see anything except for the high mountains and nothing else." Her chest rose and fell as she tried to steady her breathing. Closing her eyes tightly, she took a deep breath, her hands clenched into fists. After a long moment, she exhaled slowly and opened her eyes again, their sharpness cutting through me like a blade. "Listen," she said, her tone firmer now, though still laced with desperation. "Just do me one thing, Damien. Get me out of this place and back to my home. I don't want to get tangled in this shit anymore." Her voice broke, and for the first time, I saw the depth of her fear and exhaustion. The walls she'd built around herself were starting to crumble. "Get me back, and put a spell on me, just like you did to Ethan. Erase my mind from all of this madness, from you, from everything. I don't want anything to do with this world anymore." Her words hit me harder than I expected, sending a strange ripple of unease through me. I watched her closely, the pain and fear radiating off her in waves, and it twisted something inside me. I didn't speak, but I could feel it. Something was wrong, not just with her words, but deeper, something festering beneath the surface. I focused, trying to delve into her mind to see where the fear came from, to understand the source of her pain. But as I tried to push deeper, my thoughts slammed against a wall, like trying to break through stone. Her mind was closed off to me, completely. I couldn't read anything, couldn't sense anything beyond the surface. I stepped back, stunned. How was she doing this? No one had ever been able to block me out. Not even Deirdre, my wife, had been able to shield her mind from me. I looked down at her, shocked. Keilah collapsed to her knees, her breaths ragged, her eyes wild with confusion and tears streaming down her face. She looked around frantically, trying to make sense of the overwhelming isolation. How on earth did I even end up here? She whispered, her voice breaking. She stood shakily, wiping her tears away, though they continued to fall. Panic was rising in her chest, and she turned, stumbling away in the direction she thought she had come from. But before she could get far, I moved. Swift as the wind, I grabbed her arm and pulled her back to me, her body nearly weightless in my hands. With a swift motion, I lifted her, hoisting her up so her face was level with mine. Without thinking, I pressed my lips to hers. It wasn't a kiss intended to comfort or soothe. Rather, it was a desperate attempt to break through the barriers she'd put up, and in that fleeting moment, something shifted. I saw it. Her mind opened just enough for me to glimpse something, an image so vivid it jolted me. Keilah, cradling a lifeless young boy in her arms, her face twisted in anguish, her body hunched over him as though shielding him from the world. The scene was suffused with grief so profound it pierced through me like a stake. But before I could see more, the image vanished, swallowed by darkness. Her mind slammed shut again as she pulled away from the kiss, struggling fiercely against my hold. Her movements were frantic, her breathing erratic. I could feel her heart racing beneath my fingertips. I blinked, my grip loosening as I gently set her down, my own breath catching in my throat. Her eyes were wide, her body trembling as she took a step back, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. But now, I knew it ran far deeper than I could have imagined. Whatever she had endured, it had shattered something inside her. And the boy I had glimpsed, who was he? What had happened to leave her so utterly shattered? Keilah's eyes flared with fury, her entire body trembling as she spoke through clenched teeth. "Take me back to my home, and I don't ever want to see you again. Ever." Her voice was sharp, filled with a venomous edge. Before I could say anything, she turned and started walking away, her movements sharp and rigid, like every step was fueled by her anger. I reached out, catching her hand to stop her and explain myself. "Keilah, wait." She whirled around, her hand flying, and before I could react, the sting of her slap snapped my head to the side. "Don't you fucking touch me," she hissed, her eyes dark with rage. I let go of her, raising my hands in surrender. "Fine," I said, my voice calm. She then turned on her heels again. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "That kiss meant nothing, if that's what made you angry. I wasn't trying to..." I paused. "I just wanted to see something." She stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. Then in a rush, she turned back toward me, her face twisted with fury. She stormed toward me, each step heavier than the last. As she closed the distance, her hand came up again, ready to strike, but I caught her wrist midair, my grip firm, but gentle. This won't help, Keilah. It's useless. Over something I told you meant nothing. Her eyes flashed with something wild as she yanked her arm away, using more force than necessary. My grip wasn't tight, so when she pulled, she lost balance, stumbling backward until she hit the ground with a dull thud. I let out a heavy breath, watching as she sat there, stunned and on the verge of bursting into tears. I breathed out heavily, taking a step forward. I extended my hand down to her, offering help, but she slapped it away as if my touch burned her. She helped herself up, brushing dirt off her clothes, her movements sharp and mechanical. Her eyes darted around, scanning the area like she was looking for a way out, any way to escape my presence. "There's no way out for humans, Keilah," I said, my voice low and measured. "I will have to fly you out of here." She stopped scanning the area, her eyes slowly turning back to meet mine, her expression shifting, hardening, like she was trying to make sense of my words. The wind picked up, tossing strands of her hair across her face, but she didn't seem to notice. Every movement she made was tense, calculated. Then, without a word, she took a single step toward me. Her gaze never wavered, her eyes locked on mine, cold and unyielding. But instead of speaking, she turned away, her back to me, though close enough to feel the heat of her fury rolling off her in waves. Her voice, sharp and cutting, broke the silence. "Get me out of this sickening place." Without a word, I wrapped my hand around her waist, pulling her against me as her body stiffened. She didn't resist, but the tension in her muscles told me she hated every second of it. In one fluid motion, I lifted her off the ground, and we vanished into the wind, soaring through the air. Within moments, we landed in the courtyard of Seth's chamber. The moment her feet touched the ground, she pried herself from my grip, like my touch sickened her. She stumbled, nearly falling, but quickly regained her balance. Her glare was sharp, cutting through me like a blade. "This isn't my home," she spat, her eyes sweeping the unfamiliar surroundings. "I said I wanted to go. To my home. My house. Damien." Before I could respond, a harsh, echoing voice cut through the air. Seth stood at the entrance, his daughter beside him, her expression unreadable. "Mind your language, young woman," Seth said coldly, his eyes narrowing at Keilah. I raised a hand, waving him off, but Seth wasn't finished. "You need to learn how to address him properly. Or else." "Or else what?" Keilah snapped, cutting him off. Her voice dripped with defiance. "You'll make me your dinner? Feed me to your family? I bet he'll let you." She motioned toward me, her words like venom. "Because he sees me as his food too, don't you? Just waiting for the perfect moment. Isn't that why you refused to take me back to my place?" I could feel Seth's anger boiling over, his fists clenched, his body on the verge of snapping. I met his gaze, silently warning him not to dare touch her. His eyes flickered with fury, but he held back. "You know what?" Keilah continued, her voice unwavering. "I'll take myself home." Before she could make it to the door, I grabbed her arm and pulled her back with a force that made her stumble. My eyes locked onto hers, and I growled, twisting my face into something that I knew would unsettle her. "Don't forget, you're just a human in vampire territory. It's me who wants you out of my life more than you want out. So calm your little ass down until I find a solution for you to live peacefully." She stared up at me, unwavering, trying to mask her fear. But I could smell it, sharp and clear, no matter how much she tried to hide it. Slowly, I released her arm, letting the tension between us settle. I motioned for Seth's daughter to come forward. "Garby, look after her." Garby nodded, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, of course, King Draven." I turned toward the door, my mind racing. "I'm smelling too much death," I muttered to Seth. "I need to stop these suckers." As I stepped through the doorway, Seth followed closely behind. "Do you need company? There might be many." "Doesn't matter how many," I replied, a cold edge in my voice. "I can take care of them." With that, I vanished into the night, following the cries, the fear, and the unmistakable stench of blood in the air. When I neared the area, the scene that unfolded before me was enough to freeze my blood. A group of cast-off vampires clustered around their campsite, feasting on humans they must have captured. The gruesome sight of their prey, lifeless and limp, sickened me. As I landed, the vampires halted their gruesome feast, their heads snapping in my direction. I could see the numbers. Innocent people sprawled across the ground, some already dead, while others gasped for breath, huddled together in terror. A few of them had wet themselves in fear, the stench of urine mingling with the metallic scent of blood. "King Draven," their leader sneered, a sickly grin stretching across his face. "What brings you to our little feast?" I stepped forward, the air crackling with my power. "This is not a feast. It's a massacre," I replied, my voice low and steady. "You've crossed a line." "What line do you speak of?" he retorted, feigning nonchalance. "This is merely a minor indulgence for our kind. As our king, shouldn't you be reveling in it? After all, it's what we survive on, just as you do." "Let the humans go," I commanded, my tone sharp. The leader smirked, a mocking light in his eyes. "I'm sorry, King. Oh, point of correction. You aren't our king. We are the cast-outs. What we do, our rules." I took a frustrated breath, closing my eyes to center myself. As I focused, I cast a forgetting spell over the conscious humans. They slowly slumped against each other, blissfully asleep. With a flick of my wrist, I opened my eyes again, ready to confront these outcasts. As if on cue, two of them lunged at me from behind. I caught them effortlessly, slamming them against each other with a bone-jarring impact, before tossing them aside like rag dolls. But more came, a swarm of fangs and claws, driven by desperation and bloodlust. I felt a twisted smirk creep onto my lips. "You scumbags aren't worthy of my powers," I taunted, my fists clenched tight. "I'll take you down with my bare hands if I must. Let's see who's left standing when the last of you is gone." The fight erupted into chaos. Vampires lunged at me from all angles, their snarls filling the air as I met each attack with ferocity. My fists connected with skulls, snapping necks, and tearing heads clean off bodies. Blood sprayed in all directions, slick and warm, coating my skin. Claws raked my arms and fangs tore at my flesh, sharp pain coursing through me like wildfire. I growled in response, a primal instinct rising from within as I pushed past the injuries. I could feel their blood soaking into my clothes, a reminder of the price I was paying for this fight. One by one they fell before me, each defeat punctuated by the guttural cries of the damned. I reveled in the carnage, my body moving like a well-oiled machine, each blow landing with deadly precision. Finally, I found myself face to face with the last one standing, their leader. He was a grotesque figure, blood smeared across his lips, eyes filled with a cruel, defiant light. I spat out the greasy blood that had pooled in my mouth, wiping my lips with the back of my hand, a gesture of disdain. "Well, what do you have to say, Mr. Castout?" I asked, my voice low and menacing. "Do you have a death wish? Because you're following your disgusting friends." He sneered, defiance etched in his features, but I saw the flicker of fear behind his boldness. "You think you can kill me?" He spat, but I could sense the tremor in his voice. "Definitely yes. It's what I am about to do."
Keilah's point of view. I watched as Damien stormed out, the air around him tense and charged. The other creep of a guy followed close behind, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I hated how scared I felt, how that brief moment when Damien grabbed my arm, turning on a monstrous face, still made my skin crawl. I'd stood my ground, put on a brave face, but now that he was gone, all that courage crumbled. My knees wobbled, and before I could regain my balance, they buckled, causing me to stumble and collapse onto my haunches. I tried to catch my breath, but it felt like my chest was tightening, the fear and anger all building up like a knot inside me. Garby rushed toward me, her eyes wide with concern, and for a split second, I thought about letting her help. But the second she reached for me, I jolted back, shouting, "Get away from me!" She stepped back, startled, her eyes full of shock. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you, I just want to help." "Help?" I snapped, my voice trembling with anger and fear. "I don't need your help, young girl. Just get away from me. I don't need you. I don't need anyone." I pushed myself up, my hands still shaking. And then, before I could move another inch, I felt hands lifting me. The grip was rough, and I twisted, realizing it was the creep guy whom I thought went with Damien. His eyes blazed with a strange, unnatural color, and his fangs were bared. "You don't talk to my daughter like that, do you understand?" He snarled, his voice dark and threatening. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I swung my leg back and kicked him in the balls as hard as I could. He let go, staggering back, but his eyes flashed with rage. The growl that came from him was so deep it rattled through my bones. He lunged toward me, but before he could get any closer, Garby threw herself between us, wrapping her arms around him, her face pale. "You can't, Dad," she pleaded, her voice desperate. "She's King Draven's woman. If anything happens to her, he'll kill you." I backed up, my heart racing, watching as his eyes fixed on me with a feral intensity. The way he looked at me, it was like staring into the eyes of a wild animal, a predator ready to tear me apart. "I'm not his woman!" I shouted, my voice breaking as I took another step back, my entire body trembling. I turned and stumbled back to the room I'd woken up in earlier, slamming the door shut behind me. The second I was alone, I slid down to the floor, my body shaking uncontrollably. The fear, the anger, the confusion, it all crashed over me, and I buried my face in my hands, trying to hold back the tears, but no matter how hard I tried, my body continued to tremble, the fear and anger mixing into a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my arms wrapped tightly around my knees, my whole body curled up as if I could somehow make myself small enough to disappear. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't make sense of how my life had spiraled into this nightmare. One moment, I had control, and I had my freedom. Now, everything was slipping through my fingers, caught in the tangled web of Damien. My heart ached from the fear, the uncertainty, and the cold reality that I had no idea how to get out of this mess. How did it all spiral so fast? I clenched my fists, burying my face deeper into my knees, trying to block out everything. I just needed a moment, 1 second to breathe and to calm the storm that raged inside me. Then, a soft knock interrupted my thoughts. My breath hitched and I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping whoever it was would go away. I didn't want to deal with anyone right now, least of all the vampires in this place. The knock came again, and this time a soft voice followed. "Can you open the door, please?" It was that girl, Garby. Her voice was hesitant, almost pleading. I'm sorry for my dad's behavior. Please don't tell King Draven about it. He'll kill him. Please. I clenched my jaw, biting back the overwhelming urge to scream. I didn't want to deal with this. Not her, not her father, not the motherfucking Draven. Fine, I muttered coldly, my voice barely above a whisper. I won't say anything. Now leave. I want to be alone. There was a long silence from the other side, and for a moment I thought maybe she had listened and walked away. But then her voice returned, softer this time, almost fragile. Can we please talk? Just 1 minute and I'll leave you. I promise. A wave of frustration surged through me, and I wanted to snap at her, to tell her to go away and leave me in peace. But then I remembered how her father had almost killed me earlier, how his fangs had flashed with murderous intent, and how she had been the one to stop him. If it hadn't been for her, I shuddered at the thought. She had saved me, in her own way. I sniffled, wiping the tears from my face with the back of my hand. My throat tightened as I stood up slowly, each movement heavy with exhaustion. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and opened the door. Garby stood there, her expression soft and almost apologetic. She looked so innocent, standing there with her hands clasped nervously in front of her. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then the darker thought crept in. How many people had she killed? How many lives had been taken, all in the name of feeding on their blood? The thought made me shiver, goosebumps trailing across my skin. I couldn't help but see her differently, even if she had helped me. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. Fine, I said, my voice quieter now, though still edged with unease. Come in. I walked toward the wooden bed, my steps heavy and my body tired. As I sat down on the edge, Garby followed, her small frame moving hesitantly until she perched herself next to me. I glanced at her, trying to read her expression, but she just stared at me, an unreadable look in her eyes. What do you want? I asked, my tone gentler than before, though I still felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. Garby tilted her head, her expression softening as she replied, You're a bit scary. I turned to her, the words surprising me. Letting out a small chuckle, I shook my head. What makes you think I'm scary? Is it because I snapped at you earlier? I sighed, my shoulders slumping as I added, If that's the case, I'm sorry. I'm not the kind of person to snap at people. I just don't. My voice trailed off and I took a deep breath before finishing. I just don't want anything to do with vampires anymore. Not just vampires, but every supernatural being. Garby held my gaze for a long moment, her eyes searching mine before she finally asked, What did the supernatural beings do to you? Did they hurt you? I sighed again, my gaze shifting to the floor as I straightened up. Let's change the topic, I said firmly. I'm not ready to indulge in that conversation with a teenage girl. Garby's expression grew serious as she replied, No, you're wrong. I'm not a teen. I raised an eyebrow. Of course you're not. It's what teenagers say when they want to do some shit behind their parents' backs. She frowned, her tone quick and defensive. I'm telling you the truth. I'm not. Okay, I may look like a teenager, but I'm actually over 100 years old. I gave her a long look, waiting for the punchline. But when I saw how serious she looked, a laugh burst from me, only to die down as I realized she wasn't joking. You're serious? I muttered, my eyes widening. How is that possible? Oh, I almost forgot. You're not human. The thought settled in, but then another realization hit me. Wait, if you're over 100 years, then what about Damien? Garby clamped a hand over my mouth, her eyes wide as she hissed, King Draven. I pulled her hand away gently, rolling my eyes. Fine, King Draven. How old is he? Without a moment's hesitation, she replied, He's over 1,000 years old. My mouth fell open, my mind struggling to process the information. 1,000 what? Years, I whispered, utterly flabbergasted. Garby nodded solemnly. Yes, he's the oldest of our kind who's left. That's why he's the king. I tried to wrap my head around it all. 1,000 years, the weight of it made me feel dizzy, but curiosity pushed me forward. Is he your king because he's the oldest one? Or was he born in a kingdom? Like, does he have royal blood in him? Garby gave me a wary look. You're asking too many questions, and I barely know you. I can't say more than what I've told you. I pressed on, a hint of a smile tugging at my lips. You can tell me a little more. I'm just curious to know about his royalness, that's all. She shook her head firmly. No, ma'am, thank you. Why are you suddenly interested? Moments ago, you said you didn't want anything to do with supernatural beings. I blinked, realizing I had unconsciously leaned closer to her as I fished for information. I leaned back quickly, clearing my throat. Ah, yes, you're right. No more questions. Garby tilted her head, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Can I ask some questions too? I nodded, lifting a hand as if to set a boundary. As long as they're not about me. She agreed, her expression brightening as she scooted closer to me, as if being near would help her hear better. What's the human world like? How's life there? I've heard it's quite fascinating. I stared at her for a moment, baffled by her words. What do you mean? I asked. Haven't you been in the human world before? She shook her head, her expression serious. No. But aren't we in the human world right now? I asked, thoroughly confused. Garby shook her head again. No, we're not. Her voice dropped as she added. We are in the underworld kingdom. Her words felt like a punch to my gut. The underworld kingdom? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. My mind raced, trying to process what that meant. The name itself sent chills down my spine, and I had to fight the urge to shiver. So this means I'm in a different realm? Garby nodded, her eyes meeting mine. Yes. This is where our kind resides, away from the human world. It's safer for us here. I looked around the room, suddenly feeling like the walls were closing in. Everything had felt strange from the beginning, but knowing I wasn't even in the human world made it worse. So I'm stuck here? In the underworld? She hesitated before nodding slowly. For now, yes. My chest tightened, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. And there's no way back? Garby's face softened. It's not that simple. The passage between the human world and the underworld is guarded. Only those with permission from King Draven or a high-ranking vampire, which is my dad, can cross. I slumped back, feeling the weight of her words. So I'm at his mercy. She didn't respond immediately, and I noticed the way her hands fidgeted, as if she didn't know how to comfort me. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean for you to get caught up in all of this. I scoffed lightly, a bitter smile forming on my lips. Not your fault. I didn't expect my life to turn out like this. Silence settled between us for a moment, and I watched as Garby's eyes flicked down, her expression unreadable. She seemed hesitant, like she wanted to say something but held back. Finally, she looked up. I know it's scary being here, and I know you probably hate everything about this place, but it's not all bad. She gave me a small, hopeful smile. If you want, I could show you around sometime. Maybe help you see it differently. I stared at her, unsure of what to say. There was a sincerity in her eyes that caught me off guard, and for a moment, I almost believed that maybe, just maybe, this place wasn't entirely a nightmare. But then the memory of her father flashed through my mind, and the terror I felt resurfaced. On top of that, the last time someone said such kind words, it led to nothing but pain and betrayal. I'm sorry, but I have trust issues when it comes to this matter. You people are vampires who depend on our blood to survive. Yet you expect me to believe that this place isn't dangerous? I replied, my voice tinged with skepticism. We don't feed on humans here, she replied curtly. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, really? Then what do you feed on? We don't feed on humans, but on animals, she clarified. I chuckled, shaking my head in disbelief. I don't get it. You don't drink human blood, but animals? And you live in the underworld, where I only saw hills and more hills. Where do you even find the animals? What baffles me the most is that it's the underworld, yet there are hills and mountains. How's that possible? Garby smiled, a glint of excitement in her eyes. You'll see it tomorrow. Trust me, you'll be surprised. And don't worry, no one can touch or hurt you. You're King Draven's woman, and that's respected here. As I opened my mouth to protest her insistence on calling me Damien's woman, she stood up. See you tomorrow, she said cheerfully. And have a rest, though you didn't tell me about the human world, but that's okay. We have tomorrow. With that, she walked out, leaving me alone to ponder her words and the surreal reality I had been thrust into. The moment she left, I turned my gaze toward the so-called bed, a makeshift structure made of hard bare wood. Is this where I'm supposed to sleep? I couldn't help but scoff at the thought. With a heavy sigh, I lifted my feet off the floor and curled up on the rough surface, trying to find some comfort in its rigidity. As I nestled into myself, the thoughts of my baby Evan swirled back into my mind. First came the happiest memories. His laughter, the way he would light up at the simplest things, his tiny fingers wrapping around mine. Each recollection brought warmth to my heart, a fleeting moment of joy that felt so distant now. But then, like a dark cloud rolling in, the grief descended, heavy and suffocating. My heart ached as I thought of the moments that had been stolen from us, the dreams that would never come true. The weight of loss closed around me, squeezing tighter and tighter, until it felt like I could hardly breathe. I could feel the walls of the room closing in, the shadows dancing mockingly around me. My head spun, the weight of grief dragging me deeper into a darkness from which there seemed to be no escape. It was overwhelming. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately trying to block out the pain, but it persisted, relentless and suffocating just as it always was. I sobbed, tears streaming down my face as I wrapped my arms tighter around myself and trying to muffle the sound of my cries. The images of my baby Evan crashed over me in relentless waves, his little adorable laughter echoing in my ears, his soft voice calling me Mama. And then, hauntingly, the memory of his fragile body cradled in my hands. I gripped my hair tightly. It hurts, desperate to stop the memories from flooding in. But I knew all too well that this was my nightly ritual. A relentless cycle of grief I couldn't escape. A pain that twisted my heart into knots, leaving me gasping for breath. No matter how hard I tried to push the memories away, they came rushing back, each one more painful than the last, until I felt myself collapsing under their weight. I slowly opened my eyes at the sound of my name, barely registering Garby's voice calling to me from outside the door. Keilah, are you up? As I blinked away the remnants of sleep, I felt the warm cover wrapped around me, the softness of the bedding beneath me, and the plush pillow cradling my head. Confusion washed over me. This wasn't the hard wooden floor I remembered. In a rush of realization, I threw off the blanket and hurried to the door. As soon as I opened it, Garby greeted me with an exuberant, "Good morning!" Her smile was bright, as if we were old friends reunited after a long time apart. "Good morning," I replied, a bit sheepishly, as I walked back to the now inviting bed. I sat down and felt the softness beneath me again, glancing at her. "Thank you for the bed," I said, genuinely appreciative. Garby gave me an innocent look, tilting her head slightly. "You're thanking the wrong person here. I had nothing to do with that. It must have been King Draven," she said, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Her eyes then sparkled with excitement as she asked, "Are you ready to explore my world?" I nodded, standing up, but before I could say anything, my stomach growled loudly. Thankfully, Garby didn't seem to hear it, her enthusiasm too high to notice. I was starving, but how could I mention that in a world where the only known food was blood? There was no point, I told myself. I just had to endure it. Garby took my hand without hesitation, her cold fingers wrapping around mine as she led me outside. The moment we stepped out, a gust of icy wind hit me, making me shiver involuntarily. "Jesus, it's freezing," I muttered, rubbing my arms for warmth. But then I saw it, a whole city, stretched out below the hill. My eyes widened at the sight before me. A sprawling city stretched out below, nestled at the base of the hill. It looked like something straight out of a dream, with countless lights twinkling like stars and buildings of all shapes and sizes forming a stunning skyline. I turned to Garby in astonishment, but before I could speak, she beat me to it. "My father and I live up here on the top of the hill," she said with a proud smile, pointing towards the town below. "Our beautiful town is down there. Come on, I'll show you around and introduce you to some people." Without waiting for a response, she pulled me along, dragging me down the path. My eyes darted back toward the house we had just left, its dark, imposing structure towering behind us, and then toward the lively town ahead. A deep voice, unmistakably belonging to Damien, echoed from behind, freezing Garby in her tracks. "You two, stop right there." My heart immediately raced, pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I turned around, my breath catching when I saw him standing just a few feet away. Damien's tall figure seemed even more imposing against the pale, frosty backdrop. His piercing eyes were locked on us, his tone hard and serious. "Get back here." I felt Garby tense beside me, her hand trembling slightly in mine as she whispered, "I'm in trouble." Without another word, she pulled me back toward the house, her steps suddenly hesitant. When we reached Damien, his gaze shifted from Garby to me, locking on with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I met his hard stare, refusing to back down, though my pulse was racing. "What?" I asked, my voice edged with defiance. "Am I not allowed to move around?" Damien's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked to Garby, who was standing with her head bowed. "Eyes on me when I talk to you," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for disobedience. Garby's head shot up, meeting his gaze. "I don't want this to happen again, Garby," he said, his voice low but firm. "This person you're dragging down the hill is human. She can easily die from this weather." I cut in before he could continue, bristling at his tone. "What makes you think I can die from this weather? I'm perfectly fine." His eyes snapped down to me, his expression unchanging. "It's cold out here for you." "I said I'm fine," I lied, my voice wavering slightly as my body betrayed me. The truth was, my bones were aching from the freezing cold and my arms were covered in goosebumps, but I wasn't about to admit that to him. Damien's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to Garby. "Leave," he ordered. Garby hesitated but finally nodded and hurried away. The air between Damien and me grew thick with tension. He stepped closer, his large hand taking mine as he started dragging me back inside, ignoring my weak protests. I felt the heat of his palm through the numbness in my fingers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hauled around like a child. He led me straight back to the room I had been given and pushed me gently down onto the bed. His gaze was intense as he stood over me. "Get under the covers," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I glared up at him, but the truth was, I was too cold and exhausted to resist. With a huff, I pulled the blankets over myself, trying to ignore the strange mix of frustration and something else I felt in his presence. "Are you happy now?" I muttered, my voice laced with frustration, even though it was for my own good. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked a few steps away before sitting down on a wooden stool in the corner of the room. His cold, intense gaze locked onto me, and he said nothing for a long moment. The silence was suffocating. I let out a long, exasperated breath, the tension in the air unbearable. My eyes bore into him as I sat upright, still bundled under the covers, my voice laced with irritation. "Can you now tell me why you brought me here? Garby told me there's no way back to the human world and that the only person who can take me back is me," Damien interrupted, his voice sharp. His eyes remained fixed on mine, unwavering. "Me and Seth." I blinked, caught off guard by the interruption. "But you can't go back now," he continued, his voice low but firm. "It's too dangerous for you out there." "Where exactly do you mean?" I shot back, narrowing my eyes. "Here or back at my place? Because from my point of view, it's far more dangerous for me here than at home where I find peace. If I do go back, I'll sure have to sell my house and move far away from where any supernatural being can find me." Damien pushed up from the stool, raking a hand through his hair, his expression torn between frustration and exhaustion. "Keilah, I would like to request you not to make my mind spin and just get used to things here for a little while. I promise to take you back. Until then, stay put and don't give me a hard time." I raised an eyebrow as I got up, nearly tripping from the blanket wrapped around me, feeling the familiar rise of doubt bubble up. Just as I told Garby, I have trust issues when it comes to vampires or werewolves making false promises. And how exactly do you expect me to get used to your world, Mr. King Draven, when you won't even let me interact with anyone? His eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his face, and I instinctively flinched, but just as quickly it was gone. You're free to go wherever you want, he said, his tone more controlled, as long as you don't wander off alone. Then why did you stop me and Garby? I shot back, my arms tightening the blanket over my chest. Damien closed his eyes, rubbing his forehead as if trying to fend off a headache. When he opened them again, there was a new edge to his voice. How old are you, Keilah? I furrowed my brow, confused and annoyed by the sudden shift in topic. What does my age have to do with the conversation we're having? Of course, I'm old enough. Then why are you curled up in the blankets? He interrupted, his eyes never leaving mine. Because I was freezing, I answered quickly, but as the words left my mouth, I paused, my cheeks flushing with embarrassment, as the realization of why he had stopped us earlier began to crack through my thoughts. The real reason. I wished for the ground to swallow me, the heat of mortification rushing through me, rendering me momentarily speechless. As I tried to find the right words, my stomach betrayed me again, growling louder than before. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks as his eyes flicked down, catching the sound. I opened my mouth, desperately trying to come up with something to say to break the awkwardness, but before I could speak, Damien moved. He was faster than I expected, closing the distance between us. I instinctively scooted backwards, but he tugged the blanket over my head, covering me completely. Before I could protest, he scooped me up, and in the next moment I felt the rush of freezing wind against my face. We were in the air again, so cold, but thankfully, the blanket shielded me from the worst of it. The cold was sharp, biting into my face, but then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. When he finally set me down, I blinked in disbelief. I was standing in the middle of a well-furnished modern house. Not a wooden cabin, but a real house. Spacious, elegant, and warm. My heart leapt with excitement, and for a brief moment, hope surged through me. Did he finally bring me back? I almost asked, but the excitement was short-lived. You're not in the human world. His voice cut through my thoughts, dashing my hopes like cold water. Follow me, he instructed, and I had no choice but to obey. I stuck close to his side as we entered a warm kitchen, the contrast from the cold outside making my body relax instantly. Then, the smell hit me. Bacon, French toast, butter. My stomach growled again, louder and more insistent this time. I looked at Damien, who had already opened the fridge and was pouring orange juice into a glass. Before I could ask or say a word, he set the glass down at the table beside a plate of perfectly prepared breakfast. Sit, he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Eat. I hesitated, my eyes darting from the food to him, but my hunger won out. Without another word, I moved toward the table, my mouth already watering as I reached for the plate. Damien walked away, and before I could ask him where he was going, he had already vanished. I sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and relief as I turned my attention back to the food. My hunger was too strong to ignore, and soon I was devouring everything on the plate. The bacon was crispy, the eggs were perfectly seasoned, and the French toast had just the right amount of sweetness. I drank the juice down, savoring the cool, refreshing taste until the glass was dry. With a satisfied sigh, I picked up the plate and glass, intending to wash them in the sink. But as I moved, a soft voice behind me made me pause. I'll take care of that, the woman said. I turned around and saw an elderly woman with a kind smile walking toward me. She took the plate and glass from my hands and placed them into the sink with practiced ease. Then she turned to me and said, Head upstairs, turn right, and the second door is where you should go. I've prepared a hot bath for you and a pair of clean clothes. I blinked at her, completely caught off guard. Excuse me, what? I stammered. But she didn't answer, instead gently taking my hand and guiding me out of the kitchen and toward the stairs. Go, she said softly, giving me a little nudge. Confusion clouded my mind, but I followed her instructions, walking up the stairs until I reached the second door. I hesitated for a moment before clicking it open, and my eyes widened as I stepped inside. Wow, I breathed out. The room was small but incredibly cozy, with soft lighting, warm colors, and a bed that looked impossibly comfortable. Everything about it invited relaxation, a stark contrast to the cold and wooden structures I had been in earlier. Curiosity tugged at me, and I walked to the window, eager to see where I really was. But as I pulled the curtains aside, all I was greeted with was a thick, impenetrable fog. The view beyond was nothing but a swirling, ghostly white. This is definitely the underworld, I whispered to myself, a chill creeping up my spine. Shaking off the eerie feeling, I glanced back at the bed where a neatly folded set of clothes was waiting for me: a thick sweater, black jeans, socks, and a long-sleeved shirt. Grabbing the pile, I headed into the bathroom attached to the room. The bathroom was simple, with a bathtub filled to the brim with steaming hot water. The sight of it immediately relaxed me, and I set the clothes aside, sinking into the warmth. After soaking in the warm water for what felt like an eternity, I reluctantly pulled myself out of the bathtub, feeling the tension in my muscles dissipate. I dried myself off, taking my time with each stroke of the towel, and finally slipped into the fresh clothes. The sweater was soft and warm against my skin, while the black jeans hugged me just right. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the bathroom, determined to explore this strange place. My curiosity propelled me toward the window first, hoping that the fog might have cleared, but when I opened the curtains, the same thick, swirling mist greeted me, swallowing everything beyond the glass. Disappointed but not deterred, I decided to venture out of my room, my footsteps soft against the floor. As I wandered through the hallways, I peeked into various rooms, each one more unlike a human home than the last. They were beautifully furnished, with intricate designs and a certain opulence that felt foreign to me. As I reached the last room at the end of the hallway, I paused, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension swirling in my mind. I knew it would likely be similar to the others, but I still opened it. With a quick push, the door swung open. The sight that greeted me, however, was nothing I had anticipated. Damien stood there, fresh from a shower, his hair damp and tousled, pulling on a pair of black underwear. My breath caught in my throat. In pure shock, I slammed the door shut and ran back to my room, locking it behind me. My heart raced, and I sank down against the door, feeling the heat of embarrassment flooding my cheeks. I buried my face in my hands, wishing for the universe to swallow me whole. Just suddenly, the world around me began to shift, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The room blurred, and before I knew it, I was standing in the middle of nowhere. A boundless expanse of misty landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, the fog swirling around my feet like a ghostly cloak. Panic surged through me. Where was I?
Damien's point of view.
I heard the door slam shut behind her. I didn't need to look up to know it was Keilah. Her scent, sweet and earthy, lingered in the air. She must have caught a glimpse of me just as I was pulling on my clothes. A small, amused smile tugged at the corner of my mouth, but I didn't dwell on it. I wasn't the type to get embarrassed or flustered easily. I continued dressing without so much as a pause, pulling on a black shirt and then buttoning it up with measured precision. My mind was elsewhere. Keilah's reaction was amusing and annoying, but it wasn't surprising. She was still adapting to my world, and there were many things she didn't understand. Yet. As I finished getting dressed, I allowed my thoughts to wander, calculating my next move. The truth was, I had every intention of keeping her safe, but her stubbornness made it challenging. The constant questions, the distrust, it all boiled down to one thing. Keilah didn't belong here. Not yet. And I wasn't ready to let her go either. With everything in place, I walked over to the mirror and adjusted my hair, fingers raking through the wet strands as they began to dry. My eyes flicked toward the door she had slammed in her retreat. I could hear her heart beating first, faint breaths on the other side, quick and shallow, and I knew she was leaning against the door and trying to collect herself. A slight smirk pulled at my lips. Humans. They were always so transparent. I threw one last glance toward Keilah's room, the faint sounds of her steps still lingering in my ears. She'd be fine. For now. I turned away, my expression hardening as I descended the stairs. At the bottom, Barbara waited for me, hands clasped, her gaze warm but attentive. "Thank you for coming all the way from the human world," I said, my voice low and measured. "And for everything else, cleaning the house, preparing breakfast for Keilah." Barbara's face lit up with a smile. "That's a small token for what you did for me, King Draven." I brushed off her gratitude with a wave of my hand. "That was many years ago." She interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "It might seem small to you, but it was more than that. Whatever I do, it will never be enough." I sighed, dismissively yet not unkindly. "All right, Barbara, whatever the case, thank you. And please watch over her. She'll need someone like you, a human, by her side." Barbara nodded, her eyes filled with a loyalty that was unshakable. "Always my pleasure." Satisfied, I headed out the door. Once outside, the crisp air greeted me, and I spotted Gerald and Seth waiting in the courtyard, their postures stiff and ready. They straightened as I approached. "Is everyone ready?" I asked. Gerald gave a curt nod. "Everyone is ready, King Draven." "All right," I said, my tone steady. "Let's take these humans back to their families." Just as I prepared to vanish through the air, Seth stepped forward, stopping me with a raised hand. "Let's use horses, King Draven, if you don't mind. I need to discuss something very important with you." I paused, studying his expression, then nodded. "Very well." I motioned for Gerald to proceed. "Go on, we'll find you." As Gerald disappeared through the air, Seth and I mounted our horses. The rhythmic sound of hooves echoed as we rode out of the courtyard and into the dead forest trail. The wind whipped past us, and I waited until we were a distance from the estate before I spoke. "Is this about Keilah?" I asked, my voice calm, but with a trace of curiosity. Seth's eyes remained fixed on the path ahead. "It concerns her, yes. But the real issue is that there's a big possibility that there's a second portal to the human world. It might be the one the cursed ones use to bring humans here. If that's the case, the possibility of more captives within our borders is higher." "I sensed that already," I said, my voice cold as we continued riding through the foggy forest. By the time I felt the strange energy, I continued, someone had already passed through it. They were either entering or leaving. Seth's expression was grim. "So, it's active." "Yes," I confirmed. "But first, let's deal with the dead humans and return the living ones to their families. We'll tackle the portal problem afterwards." Seth nodded, his tone serious. "Of course." We rode in silence until the looming structure of the dark tower came into view. Its shadow stretched long over the mist as we dismounted. Strong men stood at attention, waiting for us. I walked ahead, my steps echoing against the cold stone floor as I approached the square, ancient stone at the center of the chamber. "Everyone do the needful," I commanded as I reached the stone, feeling its power hum beneath my touch. I closed my eyes, chanting under my breath. The stone reacted, glowing with a pale, eerie light, as a portal slowly opened, swirling with energy. One by one, the men moved forward, each carrying 3 humans through the portal. I grabbed the 4 remaining humans, feeling their limp weight as I held them securely. "We'll be back urgently," I said to Seth, before stepping through the portal and into the human world. I moved quickly, guiding the humans to the row of parked cars. The others followed suit, placing each unconscious body carefully into the cars. Once everyone was secure, I turned to the men. Each of you is responsible for getting them safely to their homes. Once your task is complete, return here and wait for further instructions. Did I make myself clear? Loud and clear, King Draven, they replied in unison, their voices firm. Without delay, everyone got into their assigned cars, the engines roaring to life. One by one, the vehicles pulled out of the tunnel, moving swiftly through the hills. As we emerged onto the straight highway, the city skyline loomed ahead, and the operation was set in motion. The cars sped down the highway, each man knowing his designated route. I had carefully mapped out the addresses of every human they needed to return. As we approached the city limits, I pulled up beside Gerald's car, exchanging a quick nod. The others spread out, each car heading in a different direction, ensuring that we covered as much ground as efficiently as possible. Gerald and I were responsible for the furthest destination, deep within the suburbs and cities. "Let's get this done," I said, as his car veered off in a different direction. After a while, I reached a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where children played outside and parents watched from porches. I parked the car discreetly on a side street, just out of view, and turned to look at the unconscious humans sprawled in the back seat. They had no idea how lucky they were to be alive, how close they had come to being trapped in a nightmare forever. I stepped out quietly and moved to the back of the car, opening the door. The first human, a man in his early 20s, lay slumped over, his face peaceful and undisturbed. I lifted him effortlessly, carrying him to the side of the road near his home. He didn't stir, not even when I gently laid him against a fence, making it appear as though he had simply dozed off after a long walk. I murmured the familiar chant under my breath, ensuring his mind would never recall the horrors he'd seen. With one last glance at the house, I walked back to the car and shut the door softly and off to another destination. By the time I finished, the sky had deepened into a rich indigo, the sun barely a memory on the horizon. With a final glance at the quiet streets, I turned the car around and headed back to the tunnel. When I finally reached the entrance of the tunnel, it was getting dark. The fading light cast long shadows over the opening, but as I approached, I noticed everyone had returned. They stood waiting for me, leaning against their cars or milling about quietly. I stepped out, the others straightening up as I approached. "Good work, everyone," I said, my voice carrying through the tunnel. "You've done well, and because of that, these humans are safe." There were nods and murmurs of acknowledgement, and with that, I led the way back toward the portal. The air hummed with energy as we approached the square ancient stone, still glowing faintly from the enchantment. One by one we stepped through, the familiar pull of the portal wrapping around me like a cold gust of wind before releasing me on the other side. We emerged back into the underworld, the dark expanse of our realm greeting us. Seth stood waiting, his posture straight and alert as I stepped through the portal. The torches lining the cavern walls flickered, casting long shadows. "All done?" he asked, a hint of a smile on his face. "Yes," I replied, nodding. "Every human is back where they belong." "Good," he said. "Welcome back, King Draven." I gave a nod of acknowledgement, knowing we still had much to discuss. A sudden unsettling sensation washed over me, like a void where there should have been presence. Keilah's absence gnawed at me, leaving a heaviness in the pit of my stomach. The silence was unnerving. Normally, her energy, her constant troublesome presence, would make itself known, causing a relentless headache. But today there was nothing but quiet, and it didn't sit well with me. As Seth and I walked back toward the horses, he spoke up. "Let's head to the high tower. We need to deal with the outcast's situation." I stopped, halting just in front of my horse, and turned to face him. "Go ahead, Seth. I need to check on Keilah first. Something feels off." Without waiting for a response, I vanished through the air, leaving the horse behind. The wind carried me back to my house, and I landed in the foyer in a matter of seconds. Barbara was there, standing on the porch, her eyes darting around anxiously as if she had been waiting for me. The lines of worry etched on her face only deepened my concern. "Barbara!" I called out, and she jumped, startled by my sudden arrival. She quickly ran inside, her eyes wide with fear. "Keilah isn't in the house," she said, her voice trembling. She disappeared." I felt my temper tighten, but I kept it controlled. "What do you mean she disappeared?" "When you left," she explained, "I locked the house. She went to take a bath and hadn't come out of her room since. When I went to check on her, the door was locked from the inside. I used the spare key, but when I opened it..." She hesitated, her voice breaking. "She wasn't there." My heart pounded as I pushed past her, racing up the stairs to Keilah's room. The door swung open with a forceful shove, revealing an empty space. The air was still, but her scent lingered, faint and fading, like a whisper of her presence that was no longer there. I paused in the middle of the room, my eyes scanning every corner. The window, my first suspicion, remained sealed, the latch untouched. No one had gone through it. Frowning, I stalked over to the bathroom, pushing the door open with a swift motion. It was empty too, no sign of her, not even a wet towel hanging by the sink. My frustration deepened. Where could she have gone? I returned to the center of the room, inhaling deeply. Her scent, usually vibrant and fresh, was fading. It lingered most strongly by the door, and nowhere else. My fists clenched at my sides as confusion gnawed at me. Her presence vanished, as if she had simply stepped through a wall. A low growl rumbled from my chest. "Where the fuck is she now?" I muttered under my breath. "It's not like she's a witch or a ghost to just disappear like..." I stopped mid-sentence, a thought unbelievable and absurd slipping into my mind. My eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. Without a moment's hesitation, I vanished, my destination clear. Seth's cabin, perched on the hill, came into view as I landed outside, the night wind whipping around me. I stormed up the steps, my fist hammering on the door. Seth appeared, his eyes sharp with curiosity and concern. "Where is your daughter?" I demanded, my voice edged with urgency. Just as I finished speaking, Garby peeked out from her room, her face pale, eyes wide with fear, as if anticipating a punishment. Seth's brow furrowed. "Did she do something she wasn't supposed to?" he asked, his tone cautious. I shook my head, trying to keep my frustration in check. "No, don't worry. I just need to ask her something about Keilah." Seth stepped aside, and I turned to Garby, my eyes intense as I spoke. "Garby, I need to confirm something. The first day Keilah got here, what happened when she woke up? Were you the one who took her to the cliffside?" Garby's lips trembled as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, King Draven. When I went into the room, she threw a tantrum and asked me to leave her alone. Later, you appeared with her." I raked my hand through my hair in frustration, a growl slipping past my lips. Fuck. The sudden outburst made Garby flinch, her eyes watering. Seth stepped forward, concern etched on his face. King Draven, what's going on? What happened? I stopped pacing, meeting his worried gaze. Keilah has disappeared. I sucked in a breath, trying to make sense of it. And I think she did it. Unknowingly. I saw that coming, Seth said, his voice infuriatingly calm. All her blood is filled with your venom. And I think it connected with her mindset, creating that power to make her disappear. My snarl tore through the room before I could stop it. The rage needed an outlet, so I drove my foot into the cabin wall, the wood splintering under the force. It did nothing to calm me down. I turned to Seth, every muscle tensed. I need to find her as quickly as possible. He moved to block my path. I will find her. You just don't do anything. My patience snapped. What the fuck are you saying, Seth? Why would I not? Because you are my king, he said, his voice steady. And it's my responsibility to get the job done for you. To hell with the king, I roared, my voice echoing off the walls. Listen, Seth. Keilah is my responsibility, not yours. The time zone between the human world and this realm is different. She's been wandering for 1.5 days already. And if something happens to her, I'd never forgive myself. Seth's eyes hardened, meeting my anger head-on. Your responsibility, as my king, is my responsibility too. That's why I'm asking you to let me do it. I stepped closer, letting a growl escape, the primal sound vibrating in my chest. Stop me one more time, and you will not like it. Before things could escalate further, Garby's voice broke through, shaky but determined. I and the girls will help look for her too. I shifted my gaze to her, my rage cooling slightly. That would be appreciated. Seth's sigh reached my ears, his tone less confrontational but still laced with irritation. I will help too. I'm sorry for my actions. I glanced at him briefly, a silent acknowledgement, before focusing on Garby again. Her hands were trembling, but she held her ground. You and the others will search around the whole town, I ordered. And you, Seth, within the borders of the cast-outs. I'll head into the mountains where I think her mindset might have sent her, since her mind had no clear picture of this realm's places. Garby nodded, a determined look in her eyes. Right away, King Draven, she said before walking past us to gather the others. I turned to leave, but Seth's hand gripped my arm, stopping me. His face was different now, a mix of concern and regret. I'm very sorry for snapping at you, he said. It wasn't intentional. I'm just worried. And scared. I frowned, pulling my arm back. Scared of what, Seth? He hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. I'm scared that you're drawn into her so much, and scared that she will become your weakness. I clenched my jaw, the words sinking in. There's nothing to be worried about, I replied, forcing my voice to stay calm. Nothing like that will ever happen. I just need to protect her and take her back to her world without a single scratch from my people. Seth stared at me, searching for something. All right then. Promise me that when you find her, you'll take her back and never get involved with her again. I met his gaze, my expression hardening. Don't make me give promises, Seth. But what you should be sure of is that nothing more than what your stupid mind tells you will ever happen between her and me. With that, I turned away, determined to find Keilah before it was too late. I appeared at the base of the high mountains, the cold air biting against my skin as I scanned the vast expanse before me. The towering peaks loomed overhead, their shadows casting dark shapes over the land. My senses were on high alert, every nerve focused on finding her. She had to be here, somewhere. Without wasting time, I vanished and reappeared at another point farther up the mountain, the wind howling in my ears. Still nothing. No sign of her. I moved again, this time deep into the forests at the mountain's edge, searching. I stretched my senses, using every bit of power I had, hoping for a glimpse of her, a trace of her scent, anything. But there was nothing. I reappeared in the rolling hills, my eyes sweeping across the land. Even with my abilities, I couldn't find her, not a single trace. Frustration clawed at me, growing heavier with each failed attempt. How was this possible? She had to be somewhere. I tried again, pushing my powers to the limit, but every time I came up empty. Finally, I stopped, the weight of my failure sinking in. I let out a heavy breath, my fists clenching at my sides. "Why on earth can't I find you?" I muttered, my voice barely above a growl. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch around me, my thoughts racing. The one thing I didn't want to do, couldn't afford to do, was the very thing I had to consider now. My mark on her. It was a bond I hadn't fully tapped into since I brought her here. I had avoided it for my own reasons. But now, there was no other choice. Closing my eyes, I focused inward, reaching deep into the bond, summoning the mark I had placed on her. As I willed it awake, a surge of energy coursed through me, her essence intertwined with mine. My skin pulsed violently, as though it were being torn apart from the inside, and every nerve felt like it was on fire. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. It was as if I were being skinned alive. My head throbbed. The power I was using to trace the mark was too much, too forceful. The connection was there, but it was unstable, slipping in and out like a thread barely holding. The strain was unbearable. My knees buckled, and I crashed down, the sharp sting of rocks digging into my palms. A growl tore from my throat as I gritted my teeth, trying to hang on. The agony was more than I had anticipated, each pulse from the mark sending shocks of torment through my entire body. My vision blurred, the world spinning around me. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my skin, anything to keep me grounded. Just as I was on the brink of giving in, surrendering to the darkness threatening to swallow me whole, I heard it, faint but there. Her voice. Damien. It was her. Keilah. The sound of my name carried through the mark, hit me like a jolt of lightning.